Number 1. Albert Fish. In November of 1934, a woman in Manhattan named Delia Budd received a letter in the post. Her daughter Grace had disappeared 6 years earlier at the age of 10, taken from the family's apartment by a polite elderly man who had promised to bring her to a children's birthday party. For 6 years, there had been nothing. No body, no ransom, no arrest. The family had lived in that particular silence that never resolves. The letter was anonymous. It told Delia Budd exactly what had happened to her daughter, in detail, and it had been written by the man who did it. This video is not going to reproduce a word of it. What it contained is a matter of public record, and it has been printed and read aloud in 100 places. And none of that has ever served any purpose except to give a dead man an audience he specifically wanted. What matters is what the letter did. It broke the Budd family. And it caught him because the man who wrote it, in a lifetime of extraordinary caution, made exactly one mistake, and it was on the envelope. His name was Hamilton Howard Fish, who called himself Albert. The newspapers called him the Gray Man. He was born on May 19th, 1870, in Washington, D.C. His father was 75 years old at his birth and died when he was 5. His family history included significant institutionalization. Several relatives had been committed over the years, and a number of others had documented psychiatric conditions. Whatever else is uncertain in this case, the family's medical record is not. Unable to support him, his mother placed him in St. John's Orphanage in Washington. He spent the rest of his childhood there, and by his own account, it was where everything began, a place of routine corporal punishment, where he discovered that pain and humiliation did not affect him the way they affected other children. He adopted the name Albert to escape a nickname the other boys had given him. He moved to New York around 1890 and became a house painter, a trade he worked in for decades. In 1898, he married. They had 6 children. In 1917, his wife left him for a lodger who had been living in the family home and took nothing with her. Fish was left to raise 6 children alone, and by all accounts, he did his children later described him, with some difficulty, as an affectionate father who never harmed any of them. They also described the other thing. They described their father handing them a paddle studded with nails and instructing them to beat him with it. Albert Fish's inner life was organized around religion, and it had come loose from anything recognizable. He believed himself to be under instruction. He identified with the story of Abraham and Isaac, a father commanded by God to sacrifice a child, and he understood that story as a personal directive rather than a parable. He inflicted extraordinary harm on his own body over decades in the belief that it was required of him. When he was eventually examined, radiographs of his pelvic region revealed at least 29 sewing needles embedded in the tissue. Several had been there so long the bone had begun to grow around them. That X-ray still exists. It is one of the most reproduced medical images in the history of forensic psychiatry, and it is the single strongest piece of evidence in the argument about what he actually was. He traveled constantly for work across at least 23 states. He later claimed to have assaulted more than 100 children over the course of his life. Investigators were never able to substantiate that figure, and it should be treated the way we treated Pedro Elpez's number, as the claim of a man who wanted to be enormous. What was established in court is 3 murders. Francis McDonnell, 8 years old, taken from Staten Island in July of 1924. Billy Gaffney, 4 years old, taken from a Brooklyn hallway in February of 1927. Another small boy who had been playing with him gave police the only description available: an old man with gray hair and gray clothes. That description gave the press the name, the Gray Man, and Grace Budd, 10 years old, taken on June 3rd, 1928. The Budd case is the one that matters because of how it happened. 18-year-old Edward Budd had placed a classified advertisement in a New York newspaper looking for farm work. It was 1928, work was scarce, and a young man advertising his own labor was completely unremarkable. An elderly gentleman arrived at the family's apartment on West 15th Street. He introduced himself as Frank Howard, a farmer from Farmingdale on Long Island. He was courteous, well-spoken, softly dressed, and visibly frail. He offered Edward a job at good wages. He came back a second time. He brought gifts, strawberries, cheese. He sat with the family. He charmed them completely. And on his second visit, he mentioned that his sister was hosting a birthday party for her children that afternoon and asked whether little Grace might like to come. Albert and Delia Budd talked it over and said yes. There is no version of this story in which those parents did anything wrong. They were poor, they were being helped by a kind stranger, and they were living in a world without background checks, telephones in every home, or any mechanism at all for verifying who a man said he was. Grace Budd put on her white confirmation dress and left with him. The police investigation was immediate and enormous, and it went nowhere. The name was false. The address was false. There was no sister and no party. Detectives chased leads for 6 years. The case became one of the most famous unsolved disappearances in New York. Then the letter arrived. Detective William King of the New York Police Department had worked the Budd case for 6 years, and when the letter landed, he did the thing that solved it. He ignored what it said and looked at what it was. The envelope carried a small hexagonal emblem. Under magnification, it resolved into a set of initials belonging to the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. King went to their offices and asked to speak to every person with access to the stationery. Eventually, a janitor admitted he had taken some of it for personal use and had left a quantity of it behind at a rooming house on East 52nd Street when he moved out. King went to the rooming house. The landlady confirmed that an elderly man had been staying in that room, that he had moved out recently, and that he was expected back because one of his sons was posting him money there. Detective King rented a room across the hall and waited. On December 13th, 1934, Albert Fish walked in to collect his mail and was arrested. He was 64 years old, weighed about 130 pounds, and did not resist. He confessed almost immediately and led investigators to a derelict house in Westchester County, where Grace Budd's remains were found. 6 years of the largest missing child investigation in New York's history had been broken by a monogram on an envelope. The trial opened in White Plains in March of 1935 and ran for 10 days, and it was never about whether he had done it. He admitted everything. It was about one question: whether Albert Fish was legally sane. The defense called a psychiatrist named Frederick Wortham, who would later become one of the most influential figures in American psychiatry. Wortham examined Fish extensively and testified without hesitation that the man was profoundly, unmistakably psychotic, that his religious delusions were genuine, that the self-inflicted injuries were evidence of a mind operating entirely outside reality, and that he met any reasonable standard for insanity. The prosecution's position was simpler. Whatever was happening inside his head, Fish had used a false name, a false address, and a fabricated story to remove a child from her parents, and had concealed it successfully for 6 years. He knew what he was doing was wrong, because he had spent 6 years hiding it. The jury took under an hour. They found him sane and guilty. Several jurors afterwards said something remarkable. They believed he was insane. They convicted him anyway, because they had concluded he should be executed regardless. That is arguably the most honest thing anyone said during the entire proceeding, and it is a genuine problem in criminal law that has not been resolved in the 90 years since. Albert Fish was executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing on January 16, 1936. He was 65 and remains one of the oldest people ever executed by the state of New York. He is reported to have gone willingly and to have described the prospect in terms that suggested anticipation rather than fear. There is a persistent story that the needles in his body caused the electric chair to malfunction and throw sparks. It is not true. It appears in books and documentaries constantly, and there is no contemporaneous support for it. The execution was unremarkable. His attorney, James Dempsey, was given a final written statement by Fish and read it. He never released it. Asked what it contained, he said only that he would not make it public. So what do you do with Albert Fish? Every other man in this series can be explained, at least partly, in terms a listener can hold. Ridgway chose victims nobody would look for. Rader wanted to be famous. Gacy hid behind a reputation. Bundy hid behind a face. Fish does not resolve into anything. He was a frail, mannerly old man who looked like somebody's grandfather, who told police he was under religious instruction, and who had spent decades pushing needles into his own body to satisfy it. Wortham was almost certainly right. 12 jurors probably agreed with him, and they executed him anyway because the alternative was a hospital, and because in 1935 nobody in that courtroom could tolerate the idea of Albert Fish being alive in a building somewhere. The children he killed were 4, 8, and 10 years old. Their families waited years for answers, and the answer, when it finally came for the Budds, arrived in an envelope and was worse than the silence had been. The thing worth taking from this case is not the letter, and not the needles, and not the number he claimed. It is that a man walked into an apartment in Manhattan in 1928, sat at a family's table, and left with their daughter's hand in his because he was old and polite, and nobody had ever taught anyone to be afraid of that. Number 2. Alexander Pichushkin. When Moscow police searched a small one-bedroom apartment in the Zhuzino district in June of 2006, they found a man living with his mother in a flat with almost nothing in it. On a shelf there was a chessboard. 62 of its 64 squares had been filled in a coin, a number, a date on each one. 2 squares were blank. The man who lived there told them what it meant without being asked. Each square was a person. He had 2 left to go. And he told them, quite calmly, that reaching 64 would not actually have stopped him. His name was Alexander Yuryevich Pichushkin, and he had been killing people in a Moscow park for 14 years. He was also, by his own account, competing with someone. Earlier in this series, you heard about Andrei Chikatilo, convicted of 52 murders in the Rostov region and executed in 1994. Chikatilo became, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a genuine media phenomenon in Russia. Books, documentaries, films, the state that had once refused to admit serial killers existed now could not stop producing content about one. Alexander Pichushkin watched that coverage as a young man. And among the motives investigators formally recorded for his crimes was this one: he wanted to beat Chikatilo's number. Which means that one man in this series was, in a direct and literal sense, created by the fame of another man in this series. Hold on to that. We are going to come back to it. He was born on April 9th, 1974, in Mytishi outside Moscow, and raised in the south of the city near a large area of woodland called Bitsa Park. By family accounts, he was a bright, sociable, healthy small child. Then, at around 4 years old, he fell backwards from a swing and was struck in the head by the seat as it came back. The injury damaged his frontal cortex, the region governing impulse control and the regulation of aggression. The people around him described a different child afterward: volatile, difficult, prone to rages that came from nowhere. His mother moved him to a school for children with learning difficulties. He experienced that as a humiliation and never let go of it. He was bullied by children from his old school, and the bullying continued for years. The one thing that worked was his grandfather. The old man took an interest in him, took him in for a period, and taught him chess. and Pichushkin turned out to be genuinely, unusually good at it. He started playing in Bitsa Park, where retired men gathered at outdoor tables to play all day. A teenage boy who could beat pensioners at chess had, for the first time, a place where he was respected. That is the detail this whole case turns on. The park where Alexander Pichushkin was accepted as a boy is the park where he later killed dozens of people, and the elderly men he played against are the population he selected from. His grandfather died when he was in his late teens. He lost the chess table, the respect, and the only adult who had valued him, and he began drinking heavily. On July 27, 1992, at 18 years old, he killed a former classmate named Mikhail Odichuk. His account of why is important. He said he had told Odichuk he intended to become a killer and had asked him to join. Odichuk refused, and Pichushkin killed him for refusing and put his body into a sewage shaft in the park. Police questioned him. He was one of the last people known to have seen the missing man. Nothing came of it and no charge was brought. He later described that first killing in sentimental terms, comparing it to a first love, something you never forget. Then he stopped for 9 years. Between 1992 and 2001, Alexander Pichushkin worked in a grocery warehouse, lived with his mother, and killed no one. Like Rader, and like Chikatilo before him, he demonstrated that the compulsions so often described as uncontrollable can in fact be paused for the better part of a decade. In May of 2001, he started again, and this time he did not stop for 5 years. His method never changed because it never needed to. He would approach a man in or near Bitsa Park, usually elderly, often homeless, frequently an alcoholic, and tell him that his dog had died. He would say he was going into the woods to drink a bottle of vodka at the grave and ask if the man would come and drink with him. There was no dog. There was no grave. There was a bottle of vodka, and for a man sleeping rough in Moscow in 2001, that was more than enough. He would walk them deep into the park, drink with them until they could not stand, and kill them. Many of the bodies went into the open sewage shafts that ran beneath the park. In 2001 alone, he killed 11 people, 6 of them in a single month, and Moscow did not notice. This is the part that matters, and it is the same failure you have now heard in nearly every case in this series, wearing different clothes. When an elderly alcoholic is found dead in a drainage shaft in a large wooded park, in a city with a serious problem of homelessness and alcohol-related death, the file that gets opened is an accident file, not a murder file. The victims were men who were not reported missing, or who were reported by nobody. There was no pattern to find because nobody had written the cases down as the same kind of case. Bodies started to accumulate in the park from late 2005, and it took police roughly 6 months and around a dozen recoveries before the Moscow city authorities concluded they were dealing with one person. By then, he had been operating for 4.5 years, and in 2005, Pichushkin's behavior changed in a way prosecutors would later describe as escalating cruelty. The violence became more extreme. He also stopped hiding the bodies. That is not carelessness. That is a decision. He had concealed his work for years and then chose to leave it where it would be found. And the reason is the one already stated: a man competing for a record needs the record to be visible. Moscow, by early 2006, was frightened. The press had named him the Bitsa Park Maniac. People stopped walking through the woods. He was caught because of a woman named Marina Moskaliova. She worked with him. On June 13th, 2006, she agreed to go for a walk with him in the park. Before she left her flat, she wrote a note and left it where her son would find it. It gave Pichushkin's name and his telephone number and the date. She did not come home. Her son found the note and gave it to police, and investigators pulled the surveillance footage from the metro station at Kakhovskaya, which showed the two of them together. Alexander Pichushkin was arrested on June 16, 2006. A woman who had a bad feeling and wrote a name on a piece of paper ended a 14-year killing spree. That is the second time in this series a note or a license plate written down by an ordinary person has closed a case that a major police force could not. He confessed extensively, including on Russian national television, and led investigators back through the park. His trial began in Moscow in September of 2007, before a jury still relatively uncommon in the Russian system, with the defendant held in a reinforced glass enclosure in the courtroom. He treated the entire proceeding as a stage. He argued with the prosecution. He mocked the investigators. He insisted he had killed 60 and complained that he was only being charged with 48 because being charged with fewer diminished him. In his final statement, he told the court he had been prosecutor, judge, and executioner, and that he had been almost God. Judge Vladimir Usov replied that there was a difference, that Pichushkin had acted illegally. Pichushkin answered that he had not broken any laws, because he was above them. The jury deliberated for a little over 2 hours and convicted him on all counts. On October 29, 2007, he was sentenced to life imprisonment, the maximum available under Russian law, with the first 15 years to be served in solitary confinement. Russia's moratorium on the death penalty had been in place since 1996. Asked whether he understood the sentence, he told the judge he was not deaf. He was sent to penal colony number 18 in the far north of Russia above the Arctic Circle, a facility known as Polar Owl, one of the most isolated prisons on Earth, where several of Russia's most notorious offenders are held. He is still there. He is 52 years old. And in April of 2025, Russia's Federal Penal Service announced that Alexander Pichushkin had told investigators he was prepared to confess to 11 further murders. If those confessions are substantiated, his total would stand at 59, and he would formally become the second most prolific serial killer in Russian history behind Mikhail Popkov, a former police officer convicted of 78. Consider the timing of that announcement. He has been in an Arctic cell for 18 years. He is not seeking a sentence reduction. There is nothing to reduce. There is one thing a confession can still buy him, and it is the same thing he wanted in 2005 when he stopped hiding bodies. Which brings us back to where this segment started. Chikatilo's fame gave Pichushkin a target. Rader wrote letters for 30 years because he wanted a name in the newspaper. Ramirez drew a pentagram on his palm for the cameras. Bundy played to a live television audience. Elpez told a journalist a number nobody has ever been able to verify. A significant number of the men in this series wanted precisely this to be counted, ranked, discussed, and remembered. There is no way to tell these stories without giving them a portion of that, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. What can be done is to refuse the ranking. Alexander Pichushkin is not an achievement. He is a man with a frontal lobe injury and a drinking problem who spent 5 years telling homeless pensioners a lie about a dead dog, and who got away with it because Moscow was not counting the people he chose. He did not beat Chikatilo. He copied him, badly, and got caught because a woman wrote his name on a piece of paper before she left the house. The next man in this series never sought a single headline. He was found out entirely by accident. Number 3. H.H. Holmes. There is a United States Post Office in the Inglewood neighborhood of Chicago at 63rd and Wallace. People come to look at it. They come because a building once stood on that lot that has become the most famous crime scene in American history, a 3-story hotel built to swallow visitors to the 1893 World's Fair. A structure with gas jets plumbed into sealed guest rooms, greased chutes running down to a basement, a kiln for disposing of bodies, and a maze of false corridors from which no one came out. 200 people, the story goes. Maybe more. The man who built it was Herman Webster Mudgett, who called himself Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, and he is routinely described as America's first serial killer. Almost none of that is true. Not the 200, not the hotel, not the gas chambers, not the guests. And the reason to say so plainly at the start is that the real case is worse because underneath 90 years of invention, there are actual victims, and 3 of them were children, and almost nobody can name them. He was born on May 16th, 1861, in Gilmanton, New Hampshire. He was clever, and he knew it early. He enrolled at the University of Michigan Medical School and graduated in 1884, which is worth noting because it made him one of the very few genuinely credentialed men in this entire series. He had real training and a real degree. He also had, from adolescence onward, a complete indifference to the truth. He married Clara Lovering in 1878, abandoned her, and never divorced her. He married twice more while that marriage was still legally in force Myrta Belknap in 1887 and Georgiana Yoke in 1894. He arrived in Chicago around 1886, changed his name, and took a job at a drugstore in Inglewood run by a physician named Dr. E. S. Holton. Here is the first correction, and it tells you how the rest of the story was built. The popular version says Holton was an elderly man dying of cancer, whose widow Holmes then defrauded and disposed of. Dr. E. S. Holton was Elizabeth Sarah Holton. She was a young woman, and she was pregnant, which is why she was glad of the help. She and her husband William were alive and living a few blocks away years after Holmes was hanged. The story about the dying old pharmacist appears to have been spread by Holmes himself, and it survived for a century because nobody checked. Holmes took over the pharmacy and then built a large building across the street. Construction ran from around 1887 to the early 1890s. What it actually was, shops and storefronts on the ground floor, long-term rental apartments on the second. In 1892, he added a third floor and announced it would be a hotel for the coming World's Fair. It never opened. It was never finished. It was never furnished. No fair visitor ever stayed in it. The hotel was a financing story, a thing he told suppliers, investors, and insurers to extract money and credit from them. That was the point of it. Because Herman Mudgett's actual profession, the one he practiced every day for a decade, was fraud. He bought goods on credit under false names and never paid. He mortgaged property he did not own. He ran patent medicine schemes. He hired construction crews and dismissed them before payday, which is the mundane explanation for why the building's layout was so incoherent it was assembled piecemeal by workmen who kept getting fired. And yes, the building had concealed rooms and hidden passages. This part is true, and it is also completely misunderstood. They were used to hide merchandise from creditors. When a supplier came looking for the furniture he had never been paid for, it was behind a false wall. The rooms were not secret. Everyone who lived and worked in that building knew about them. A shop clerk slept in one. And in March of 1893, before the fair even opened, the Chicago Tribune ran an article describing the hidden rooms, after Holmes was caught using them to stash goods he had swindled. The whole city knew about the passages 2 years before anyone suggested a murder had happened there. So who did he actually kill? The people he killed were people he knew. Employees, lovers, business associates, people whose deaths could be converted into money or whose continued existence had become inconvenient. Julia Connor, a woman he was involved with, and her young daughter Pearl, both of whom vanished. Emmeline Sigrand, who worked for him. Minnie Williams and her sister Anna, whose property he acquired. No bodies were ever recovered in those cases. They are strongly suspected, not proven. Historians working from the primary records put the defensible total at around 9. He confessed to 27. Several of the people on that list were subsequently found alive. The murders that are certain the ones with evidence, bodies, and a conviction began with a business arrangement. Benjamin Pitesel was Holmes's longtime associate, a carpenter and fellow swindler who had worked with him for years. Together, they devised an insurance fraud. Pitesel would take out a $10,000 life policy, fake his own death, and Holmes would produce a substitute corpse and identify it. In September of 1894, in a rented property in Philadelphia, Holmes did not use a substitute. He killed Benjamin Pitesel with chloroform while he was insensible from drink, arranged the scene, and collected on the policy. He then went to Pitesel's wife, Carrie, and told her that her husband was alive and in hiding, and that he needed to take 3 of her 5 children to reunite the family. She let him take them. Alice, 15, Nellie, 11, Howard, 8. What followed was one of the strangest journeys in American criminal history. Holmes moved those 3 children across the northern United States and into Canada for weeks: Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Detroit, Toronto, while simultaneously moving their mother along a parallel route, and at points keeping mother and children in the same city on the same day without either knowing. He was by then already being hunted, and he did not know it. Because while jailed in St. Louis on an unrelated fraud charge, Holmes had explained the insurance scheme to a fellow inmate, a train robber named Marion Hedgepeth, and promised him $500 for a lawyer's introduction. He never paid. Hedgepeth wrote to the authorities. Holmes was arrested in Boston on November 17, 1894. The 3 Pitesel children were unaccounted for. And then a Philadelphia detective named Frank Geyer did something remarkable. Geyer took photographs of Alice, Nellie, and Howard and left Philadelphia in the summer of 1895 to retrace the route himself. He had no telephone network, no national database, no forensic support. He had pictures of 3 children and the knowledge that a man traveling with children has to sleep somewhere. So he checked hotel registers, city by city, boarding house by boarding house, matching handwriting and dates across thousands of miles. In Toronto, at a rented house on St. Vincent Street, he asked a neighbor whether anyone had borrowed a spade the previous autumn. The man remembered lending one to the tenant. Geyer dug in the cellar and found Alice and Nellie. He kept going. Weeks later, in Irvington, Indiana, he located the remains of 8-year-old Howard Pitesel in a rented cottage. Frank Geyer's manhunt is the actual achievement in this case, and it has been almost entirely buried under stories about trapdoors. Holmes was tried in Philadelphia in October of 1895 for one murder, only that of Benjamin Pitesel. He was convicted on November 2nd and sentenced to hang, and while he sat in that cell, the press went to Chicago and tore his building apart and invented the legend in about 3 weeks. The pattern is documented, and it is almost comic. Investigators found a rope, so the papers reported he had hanged people. They found a worn-down table, so the papers reported he had dismembered people on it. They found ashes in a wood-burning stove, so the papers reported a crematorium, which was nonsense, because a domestic wood stove cannot cremate a body, and that was pointed out at the time. The corrections were printed, they just never traveled the way the original stories did. Holmes, meanwhile, understood the market perfectly. He sold a confession to a Hearst newspaper for a large sum, in which he claimed 27 murders and described himself as having been born with evil in him. It was a commercial product written by a professional liar for money. Herman Webster Mudgett was hanged at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia on May 7, 1896. He was 34. He asked to be buried in a coffin filled with concrete, and he was. The building did not burn down that year, despite what nearly every account says. It was damaged by fire, repaired, and stood until the 1930s, when it was demolished for the post office. The term murder castle did not come into common use until decades after his death. The figure of 200 victims appears to originate in a 1940s pulp paperback and was not taken seriously by anyone at the time. The modern revival came in 2003 with a best-selling narrative history that placed Holmes alongside the World's Fair. It is a superb book, and its author is explicit in his own endnotes about which passages are reconstruction rather than record. Those endnotes are not what got repeated. In 2017, descendants had the body exhumed, partly to test a long-running theory that he had escaped and someone else was hanged in his place. Dental comparison confirmed it was Holmes. He had been there the whole time. So here is what is left when the castle is removed. A trained physician and career fraudster who killed people who trusted him women he was involved with, employees, a business partner of many years, mostly for money, mostly away from the building he is famous for, and 3 children, taken from their mother with a promise that their father was waiting for them, moved around the continent for weeks by a man who had already killed him. Alice Pittezel was 15, Nellie was 11, Howard was 8. There are no trapdoors in that. There is no maze, no kiln, no vanishing hotel guest. There is a man with a medical degree, a con to protect, and a detective named Frank Geyer knocking on doors in Toronto asking whether anybody had lent out a spade. The next case in this series produced no legend at all, which is precisely why it went on for so long. Number 4. Harold Shipman. Every other man in this series had to solve a problem. They had to get a stranger into a car or a house or a wooded area. They had to move a body. They had to explain an absence, evade a search, invent an alibi, or persuade someone to come with them. Harold Shipman had none of those problems. His victims invited him into their homes. They rolled up their sleeves when he asked. They thanked him. And when they were dead, he wrote the cause of death himself on an official form and signed it because he was the doctor, and that was his job. Nobody hid a single body because nobody was hiding anything. Every one of his victims had a funeral, attended by their families, arranged in the ordinary way. He is believed to have killed more than 200 people, and he did it in full view of an entire town over 23 years. He remains the most prolific serial killer in British history and the only British doctor ever convicted of murdering his patients. Harold Frederick Shipman was born in Nottingham on January 14, 1946, into a working-class family on a council estate. He was the middle child, and by every account his mother Vera's clear favorite. In 1963, when he was 17, Vera Shipman was dying of lung cancer at home. In the final weeks, the family doctor visited regularly to administer morphine for the pain. Harold sat with her through those afternoons and watched what the injections did the way a woman in agony became calm within moments. She died in June of 1963. He was in his last year of school. That story is told in every account of this case, and it deserves a caution. It is a tidy explanation, and tidy explanations about serial killers are usually constructed after the fact. Thousands of teenagers have watched a parent die that way and gone on to lead unremarkable lives. What can be said is that he chose medicine, and he chose that drug, and he used it on elderly women in their own living rooms for the next quarter of a century. He studied at Leeds School of Medicine and qualified in 1970. He married young Primrose Oxtoby, whom he met as a teenager, and they had 4 children. He worked at Pontefract General Infirmary, then in 1974 joined a general practice in Todmorden, West Yorkshire. And within a year, the entire thing nearly ended. In 1975, colleagues discovered that Shipman had been forging prescriptions for pethidine, a powerful opioid, and using it himself. He was confronted, he admitted it, and he was prosecuted. He was fined a few £100 and sent for a brief period of treatment. He was not struck off the medical register. Read that again. A general practitioner was convicted of forging controlled drug prescriptions and self-administering opioids, and the profession's response was a fine and a short course of rehabilitation. Within 2 years, he was seeing patients again. That single decision, the decision not to remove him, is the reason this case exists at all. His earliest suspected victim died in 1975, the same year he was caught. In 1977, he joined a practice in Hyde, a former mill town on the edge of Greater Manchester. And Hyde took to him completely. He was, by universal agreement, an excellent doctor. He gave people time. He remembered their families. He still did home visits when most practices had stopped. Elderly patients in particular adored him. He was old-fashioned in the way people said they wished doctors still were. He was outspoken in the local press about NHS underfunding. He sat on committees. When he set up his own single-handed practice on Market Street in 1993, patients followed him in large numbers. He was also, colleagues noticed, arrogant. He could be curt with staff and contemptuous of other doctors. But that is not a crime, and in a man who was clearly clever it read as confidence. His method never varied and never needed to. He would attend an elderly patient at home, usually a woman living alone, often someone in reasonable health for her age. He would administer a lethal dose of diamorphine by injection. Then he would either be present when she died or return shortly afterward and be the one to discover her. He would tell the family it had been sudden and peaceful and not unexpected at her age. He would discourage a post-mortem, explaining gently that it would be distressing and would not change anything. Grieving families accepted the word of a doctor they trusted, because that is what people do. And then he would complete the death certificate. That is the whole of it. There is no ingenuity in this case, no elaborate scheme. The system for certifying deaths in Britain was built on the assumption that the doctor is telling the truth, and Harold Shipman simply stood in the place where that assumption sat. He also altered his patients' medical records, adding backdated entries describing symptoms and conditions that had never existed, so that if anyone ever looked, the death would appear to have been coming. He obtained the drug by overprescribing for terminally ill patients and retaining what went unused, a practice that, at the time, essentially nobody was auditing. Concerns did surface. In March of 1998, a local undertaker noticed that he was collecting an unusual number of Shipman's patients and that they were often found dead, sitting up, fully dressed, in the middle of the day. He raised it with a doctor at a neighboring surgery, Dr. Linda Reynolds. Reynolds took it seriously. She contacted the coroner. The coroner contacted the police. An investigation was opened, and it was closed within about a month, having found nothing. It had been conducted without access to the necessary records and without anyone senior enough to understand what they were looking at. It was later severely criticized. Harold Shipman killed at least 3 more people after being investigated and cleared. What finally stopped him was greed and a daughter who happened to be a lawyer. Kathleen Grundy was 81 years old, a former mayor of Hyde, energetic, active in local charities, and by all accounts in good health. She was found dead at home on June 24th, 1998. Shipman had visited her that morning and was the one who certified the death. Then a will surfaced, apparently signed by Mrs. Grundy, leaving her estate of around £386,000 to Dr. Harold Shipman. Her daughter, Angela Woodruff, was a solicitor. She had handled her mother's legal affairs for years and knew exactly what her mother's actual will said. The document was, to a professional eye, an obvious forgery. It had been produced on a typewriter, the language was wrong, and the signature did not hold up. Angela Woodruff did not phone the surgery or make a complaint. She went to the police and told them she believed her mother had been murdered. Kathleen Grundy's body was exhumed in August of 1998. Diamorphine was found in her tissue. Harold Shipman was arrested on September 7, 1998. And then investigators found the thing that convicted him, and it is almost exactly what happened to Dennis Rader 4 years later on a different continent. For the same reason. Shipman had altered patient records on the practice computer. He had not understood or had not thought about the fact that the system logged the date and time of every single entry and amendment. Forensic examination of that audit trail showed, in cold detail, entries describing chronic heart conditions and declining health that had been typed into a patient's file hours after that patient was already dead. A man who had spent 23 years exploiting other people's trust was undone by a computer that did not trust anyone. The investigation widened into one of the largest in British policing history. Detectives worked back through death certificates, cremation forms, exhumations, and thousands of patient records. He was tried at Preston Crown Court from October 1999 on 15 counts of murder and one of forgery 15 cases, chosen because they were the strongest out of a pool vastly larger. He denied everything. He was combative, condescending, and lectured the court on medicine. On January 31st, 2000, the jury convicted him on every count. He was sentenced to 15 life terms with a recommendation that he never be released. He never admitted a single killing. He never gave a reason. He offered no explanation to any of the families, and he went to his grave without one. The government then established a public inquiry chaired by Dame Janet Smith, which sat for years and examined every death Shipman had certified across his entire career. Its conclusion was that Harold Shipman had killed at least 215 patients, with real suspicion attaching to around 45 more. The victims were overwhelmingly elderly women who lived alone. The youngest was in his 40s. The earliest identified death was in 1975, the year he was convicted of forging prescriptions and permitted to continue practicing. Harold Shipman was found dead in his cell at Wakefield Prison on January 13, 2004, the day before his 58th birthday. He had taken his own life. There has been persistent speculation about the timing that dying before 60 preserved a pension payment for his wife, who maintained his innocence to the end. It has never been confirmed, and he left no note explaining himself, which was consistent with everything else he did. What came out of this case was reform, and a great deal of it. Britain rebuilt its death certification system. Independent medical examiners now scrutinize deaths that a single doctor would once have signed off alone. Cremation paperwork was overhauled. Controlled drug stocks in general practice are monitored and audited. The regulation of single-handed practices changed. The General Medical Council was substantially reformed, and doctors are now subject to periodic revalidation. Every one of those changes exists because for 23 years, one man in one small town in Greater Manchester demonstrated that the entire structure rested on a single, unexamined assumption. The families of his victims did not get a confession, a motive, or an apology. Most of them did not even get certainty about whether their mother or grandmother was one of his. What they got was a country that had to admit that the most dangerous thing about Harold Shipman was not anything he did. It was that nobody thought to check. The next man in this series was checked repeatedly. He simply told them what they wanted to hear. Number 5. David Berkowitz. In the summer of 1977, New York City had roughly 300 officers assigned to a single case. It was the largest manhunt in the history of the city. Detectives were pulled off other work. Decoy cars were parked in lovers' lanes with officers inside. Women across the 5 boroughs cut their hair short or dyed it blonde because the man they were looking for seemed to prefer young women with long, dark hair. The city was already coming apart. It was effectively bankrupt. There was a heat wave. On the 13th of July, the power failed across the entire city for 25 hours, and what followed was widespread looting and arson. And through all of it, somewhere out there, was a man the newspapers called the 44 caliber killer. 300 officers, 13 months, 6 people dead and 7 wounded. He was caught because of a parking ticket. His name was David Berkowitz, and he is one of the very few men in this series who got exactly what he wanted. Because what he wanted was for everyone to know he was there. He was born on June 1st, 1953, in Brooklyn, and given up for adoption almost immediately. He was raised by Pearl and Nathan Berkowitz, a Jewish couple in the Bronx who ran a hardware store, and by every account they loved him, and he knew it. His childhood was not violent. There was no abuse, no deprivation, no monstrous parent. There was, however, something wrong with him early. He was a big, awkward, unhappy child who set fires, bullied other children, and could not manage his own temper. In 1967, when he was 14, Pearl Berkowitz died of cancer. It is the hinge of his life. He has said so himself in every interview he has ever given. The one person he was securely attached to was gone. His father remarried and eventually moved to Florida, and David Berkowitz was left with an anger he described decades later as uncontrolled and without a target. He joined the army in 1971 and served in South Korea. He was, it turned out, an excellent marksman, which is the only genuinely relevant skill he ever acquired. He came home in 1974, drifted through jobs, and eventually took work at a postal sorting facility. He lived alone, first in the Bronx, then in a small apartment in Yonkers. And in 1975, he found his birth mother. He learned that his name at birth had been Falco. He learned that his biological mother had conceived him during an affair with a married man. He learned he had a half-sister who had grown up in a family he had never been part of. He said later on tape that discovering he had been an accident degraded him and that it fed directly into what he did afterward. Because what he did afterward was shoot young couples sitting in parked cars. The first attack came on Christmas Eve, 1975, and it was with a knife. 2 women were attacked in the Bronx. Both survived. He found the experience unsatisfying. Then he bought the revolver, and everything changed. On July 29, 1976, in the Bronx, he approached a car containing 2 young women and opened fire. Donna Loria, 18, was killed. Jody Valenti, 19, was wounded. Over the next 12 months, he attacked again and again across the Bronx, Queens, and eventually Brooklyn. Carl De Niro was shot and survived. Donna DeMasi and Joanne Lomino were shot outside Lomino's home. Lomino was left permanently paralyzed. Christine Freund was killed in January. Virginia Voskerikian, a 19-year-old student, was killed in March while walking home from the subway with her books in front of her. In April, Valentina Suriani and Alexander Esau were killed in a parked car in the Bronx, and at that scene he left a letter. It was addressed to a police captain, and in it he named himself. He said he was the son of Sam. He wrote about a father who ordered him to hunt, about being programmed to kill, about the blood of women. The letter was almost gleeful. It was also deliberately a performance. A month later, he wrote again, this time to Jimmy Breslin, the most read newspaper columnist in New York. Breslin's paper published it, and the city's newspapers sold in numbers they had not seen in years. That is the thing to understand about the letters. David Berkowitz was not confessing. He was publishing. He had discovered that a man with a gun and a pen could make 8 million people talk about him, and he escalated accordingly. On July 31st, 1977, he shot Stacy Moskowitz and Robert Violante as they sat in a car near Shore Parkway in Brooklyn. Moskowitz, 20, died. Violante, also 20, survived and lost most of his sight. It was his last attack, and it was the one that ended him because, unlike the others, this one happened in a neighborhood where people were out on the street at that hour. A woman named Cecilia Davis had been walking her dog. She noticed a police officer writing a parking ticket for a car left too close to a fire hydrant. A short time later, she saw a man walking quickly with something in his hand, and she thought it was odd enough to mention. Detectives went back and pulled every parking ticket issued in that area that night. There were only a handful. One of them had been written for a Ford registered to a David Berkowitz of Pine Street, Yonkers, and when detectives contacted Yonkers police about the name, they got an unexpected response because Berkowitz was already known there. He had been sending threatening anonymous letters to his neighbors. He had shot a neighbor's dog. Local officers had a file on him as a nuisance and a crank. On August 10th, 1977, police waited outside his building. He came out, got into the car, and was arrested with the revolver beside him. He did not resist. He asked what had taken them so long. 300 detectives, 13 months, a city in a state of collective panic closed by a $25 parking violation and a woman walking her dog. Then came the story that made him permanently famous. Berkowitz told investigators that his neighbor Sam Carr owned a black Labrador, that the dog was inhabited by a demon, and that the demon had been howling orders at him for months, demanding blood. It went around the world. It is still the first thing most people can tell you about this case. It generated a film, a nickname, and 40 years of documentaries about demonic possession. He made it up. Berkowitz admitted in 1979 and has repeated since that the demon dog was an invention, a story constructed to support an insanity defense. There was no demon. There was a young man with a rifle range certificate and a great deal of unfocused rage, who had worked out that the crazier he sounded, the better his chances. He was found competent. He pleaded guilty in 1978 and was sentenced to 25 years to life on each count, to run consecutively 365 years. He has since offered a different account at various times, suggesting he did not act alone and was connected to a cult. Those claims have been investigated repeatedly over decades and have never been substantiated. They should be treated the way we treated Pedro Elpez's 300 and Holmes's 200 as statements by a man with a documented history of telling investigators whatever serves him at the time. The case also produced something no other case in this series did. It changed American law. When publishers began offering large sums for his story, New York passed legislation in 1977 to stop convicted criminals profiting from accounts of their crimes. The statutes became known as Son of Sam laws and spread across the country. The original New York version was struck down by the United States Supreme Court in 1991 on free speech grounds, and a revised version was enacted afterward. A man who killed 6 people in order to be famous is the reason there is now a body of American law about whether criminals can sell their notoriety. David Berkowitz is still alive. He is 73 years old and held at Shawcross Correctional Facility in Ulster County, New York. In 1987, he converted to Christianity. He now calls himself the Son of Hope, signs his letters Brother David, and works as a minister to other inmates. He has been eligible for parole since 2002 and has been denied 12 times. And in May of this year, 2026, he did not attend his 13th hearing at all. He told a reporter he was not seeking release, that he considered himself already free, and that the only place he was interested in going was heaven. Robert Violante, who was 20 years old in that car in Brooklyn and who has spent nearly 50 years without most of his sight, was asked to respond. He said he doubted very much that Berkowitz was going to heaven and that he was lucky not to already be somewhere else. That exchange is the whole case in miniature. For half a century, David Berkowitz has been talking letters to newspapers: a demon in a dog, a cult, a conversion, a congregation, an email about heaven. He has never once stopped being the author of his own story, and the people he shot at have had to live inside it. Stacy Moskowitz was 20. Donna Loria was 18. Virginia Voskerikian was 19 and carrying her schoolbooks. Alexander Esau was 20. Valentina Suriani was 18. Christine Freund was 26. Joanne Lomino never walked again. None of them were part of anything. There was no demon, no cult, no message, and no meaning. There was a man in a car park with a revolver who wanted 8 million people to say his name. They still do. The next man in this series never sent a letter, never gave a name, and was never caught at all. Number 6. Aileen Wuornos. In January of 1992, a jury in Volusia County, Florida, took under 2 hours to convict a 35-year-old woman of murdering a man named Richard Mallory. They recommended death by a vote of 12 to nothing. 9 months later, a newspaper reported something about Richard Mallory that the jury had never been told. In 1957, Mallory had broken into a woman's home in Maryland and attacked her. He was convicted, and he spent years afterward held in a prison psychiatric institution. Institutional records from that period described him as having pronounced sociopathic traits. The woman convicted of killing him had testified, under oath, that he had raped her and that she shot him defending herself. Her own lawyer never found the record. It took a journalist with access to a criminal database roughly an afternoon. This does not make Aileen Wuornos innocent. It is important to be clear about that from the beginning because this case gets flattened in both directions constantly. 6 other men were also dead. Most of them had no history remotely like Mallory's. She robbed all of them, took their cars, and pawned their possessions. And she would eventually stand in a courtroom and say that only one of the 7 had ever laid a hand on her. But that missing record tells you what kind of case this is. Almost everyone involved in it was performing, profiting, or failing at their job, and underneath all of it were 7 dead men and 1 woman who had been failed by every institution she ever encountered, starting when she was a child. She was born Aileen Carol Pittman on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. Her mother was 15 when she married. Her father, whom Aileen never met, was a convicted child sex offender who was diagnosed with schizophrenia and took his own life in prison in 1969. Her mother abandoned her and her older brother before Aileen was 4. They were taken in by their grandparents and raised believing their grandparents were their parents. She found out the truth as a child from other children. The court record in her case sets out what followed, and it is not disputed. At around 14, she was raped by a family friend and became pregnant. She concealed it for 6 months. When it emerged, her grandparents blamed her. She gave birth in a home for unwed mothers, and the child was taken for adoption. Her grandmother died the following year. Her grandfather, whom she said had abused her throughout her childhood, refused to keep her. She was made a ward of the court at 15, dropped out of school, and for a period lived outdoors in the woods near her old house. She survived from that age by selling sex, mostly to men in cars. That is not a mitigating narrative constructed afterward by a defense team. Several people who grew up alongside her later testified that they would have said all of this in court if anyone had asked them. Nobody asked them. Her trial lawyers never contacted them, though reporters found them easily. She spent her 20s drifting between Michigan and Florida with a substantial criminal record: armed robbery, forgery, car theft, firearms offenses, resisting arrest. She married a man nearly 50 years older than her in 1976. It was annulled within weeks after he obtained a restraining order. In 1986, in a bar in Daytona Beach, she met Tyria Moore. It became the central relationship of her life. They lived together in motels and rented rooms across Central Florida for 4 years, more working service jobs, Wuornos working the highways. And on November 30th, 1989, Richard Mallory, 51, closed his electronics repair shop and drove toward Volusia County. His body was found in woods 2 weeks later, shot several times with a small caliber handgun. Over the following 11 months, 6 more men were killed along the same corridor of Central Florida Highway. David Spears, 43, a construction worker. Charles Carskadden, 40, who worked the rodeo circuit. Peter Seams, 65, a retired merchant seaman who did missionary work. His body has never been found. Troy Burris, 50, delivering sausage on his route. Charles Humphreys, 56, a retired Air Force major who had worked as a police chief and later as a child abuse investigator. Walter Antonio, 62, a trucker and police reserve officer. They were shot, robbed, and left off roadsides and in woodland. Their cars were taken and abandoned. The break came from a car crash. On the 4th of July, 1990, Peter Seams's car was wrecked and abandoned in Orange Springs, and witnesses saw 2 women walking away from it. Their descriptions produced police sketches. A palm print inside the car was later matched to Wuornos. When the sketches were published in November of 1990, tips came in naming 2 women known locally as Lee and Ty. Aileen Wuornos was arrested on January 9th, 1991, at a biker bar called The Last Resort in Port Orange on an unrelated, outstanding warrant. Tyria Moore was located in Pennsylvania and agreed to cooperate. Police put her in a Florida motel room and had her telephone Wuornos in custody, repeatedly telling her that she, Moore, was going to be charged unless Aileen took responsibility. Those calls were recorded. On them, Wuornos tells Moore she will not let her be dragged into it and that she did everything herself. She confessed on January 16th, 1991. In that first confession, she said she killed the men because they had become violent or threatening. She did not, at that stage, say that Richard Mallory had raped her. She went to trial in January of 1992 for Mallory's murder only. 2 things decided that trial. The first is that the prosecution was permitted, under a Florida evidentiary rule, to present detailed evidence of the other 6 killings. In most circumstances, a jury never hears about other alleged crimes, precisely because of the effect it has. This jury heard about all of them. The second is that Wuornos was the only witness her defense called. She testified for 3 hours and described a prolonged, violent assault by Mallory. It was the only eyewitness account of the killing that existed, and the Florida Supreme Court later acknowledged that if the jury had believed it, the verdict could have been very different. The prosecutor asked her why she had never mentioned any rape during her confession the previous year. She said she had been interrupted. The jury did not believe her. When the verdict was read, she shouted at them. What the jury never heard was Mallory's record. Her trial counsel did not find it. In later appeals, that failure was raised directly as ineffective assistance, the argument being that a documented history of exactly the conduct she described could have corroborated her account of that specific night. The courts held it would not have changed the outcome, largely because of the other 6 men. And here the story turns again, because of something Wuornos herself said. In March of 1992, she pleaded no contest to 3 more murders, saying she wanted to get right with God. And she stated in court that Richard Mallory had violently raped her, as she had said, but that the others had not. She said it herself. One of the 7. She received 6 death sentences in total. What surrounded her for the next decade was an industry. Shortly before her trial, she was legally adopted by a born-again Christian woman named Arlene Corll, who said God had sent her. Adoption granted visiting rights that non-relatives did not have. Corll was soon negotiating with producers and writers The documentary filmmaker Nick Broomfield, making a film about the case, recorded her attorney's conduct and documented allegations that police officers involved in the investigation had been discussing film rights to the story while it was still active. 3 officers were investigated over it. Broomfield's central observation was simple. He could not find a single person around Aileen Wuornos who was not trying to make money out of her. By 2001, she had stopped defending herself entirely. She fired her appellate lawyers, demanded her execution, and recanted the self-defense claims, outright stating that she had killed the men to rob them, that she felt no remorse, and that she would kill again if released. She also said in the same period that her mind was being interfered with by sonic pressure through the walls of her cell, that her food was contaminated, and that police had deliberately allowed her to keep killing in order to make the case bigger. 3 psychiatrists examined her. Each interview lasted around 15 minutes. All 3 found her competent to be executed. Broomfield, who had known her for a decade and filmed her the day before she died, said publicly that he did not believe she was sane and that Florida executed a woman who had lost her grip on reality. Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison on October 9, 2002. She was 46. She declined a last meal and took a cup of coffee. Her final statement was brief and strange about sailing with the Rock, about returning with Jesus, and that she would be back. The following year, a film about her won an Academy Award, which is the outcome she had spent a decade being told was coming. She was not, as she is often called, America's first female serial killer. She was the first woman the FBI profiled as one, which is a different thing, and the distinction got lost immediately. What she actually was is harder and less marketable. 7 men are dead. Troy Burris was delivering sausage. Peter Siems did missionary work, and his family has never had a body to bury. Their families have spent 35 years watching a woman who killed them become an icon, an opera, an Oscar-winning performance, and a T-shirt. And the woman who killed them was raped at 14, made a ward of the state at 15, living in the woods before she could legally drive, and selling herself to strangers in cars from an age when most people are in school, none of which a jury was told, because nobody made a phone call. Both of those things are true at the same time. The case does not resolve, and any version of it that does resolve is lying to you. The one fact worth holding on to is the one her own lawyer missed. In 1957, Richard Mallory broke into a woman's home and attacked her, and the state of Maryland put him in a psychiatric prison for it. A jury sentenced Aileen Wuornos to death without ever hearing it. That is not a defense of what she did. It is a description of how her case was handled, which is the actual subject of this segment, and arguably of this entire series. Number 7. Dean Corll. At around 8 in the morning on August 8, 1973, a 17-year-old boy called the police in Pasadena, Texas, and told them he had just killed a man. When officers arrived at the house on Lamar Drive, 3 teenagers were sitting on the front porch. A 17-year-old boy, a 19-year-old boy, and a 15-year-old girl. Inside, in the hallway, was the body of a 33-year-old electrician named Dean Corll. He had been shot 6 times with his own pistol. The officers assumed they were dealing with a domestic shooting. It took several hours before the boy who had made the call, Elmer Wayne Henley, told them there was more and offered to show them where. Over the next 5 days, investigators dug up mass graves across 3 counties in southeast Texas. They recovered the remains of at least 28 teenage boys and young men aged 13 to 20. 17 of them came out of a single rented stall at a boat storage yard on Silver Bell Street in Houston. At the time, it was the largest number of victims attributed to one killer in American history. And nearly every one of those boys had been reported missing to the Houston police by parents who were told repeatedly that their sons had run away. Dean Arnold Corll was born on Christmas Eve, 1939, in Fort Wayne, Indiana. His parents fought constantly and divorced when he was 7, then remarried, then divorced again. He had rheumatic fever as a child, which kept him out of physical education and off playgrounds. He was quiet, isolated, and by every account polite and unremarkable. The family moved to Texas. In the late 1950s, his mother and stepfather started a small sweet manufacturing business, which eventually became the Corll Candy Company, operating out of a building in the Houston Heights directly across the street from an elementary school. Dean worked there and eventually became vice president. And he made a habit of handing out free sweets to the children who came past, particularly the boys. That is where the nickname came from, and it is worth being precise about it. The press called him the Candy Man after his death. He was not luring children with sweets in any operational sense. What the candy did was establish him, over years, as a familiar and generous adult in a working-class neighborhood, a man whose face and van and reputation were simply part of the landscape. The business closed in 1968, and he took a job as an electrician with the local power company. By then, he had already begun with the first of the two people who make this case unlike any other in this series. David Owen Brooks was 12 years old when Dean Corll first paid attention to him. Corll gave him money, food, and somewhere to be. The relationship became sexual, and Brooks, a child from an unstable home who had very little stayed. By the time Brooks was 15, the arrangement had changed. Corll was now paying him to bring other boys to the house. The figure both accomplices later gave in testimony was $200 per boy. In 1971, Brooks introduced Corll to a friend of his, a 15-year-old from the Heights named Elmer Wayne Henley. Henley's father was a violent alcoholic. His parents had separated. He had dropped out of school and was drifting around the neighborhood, drinking, doing nothing. Corll's first interest in Henley appears to have been as a victim. What happened instead is that Henley was recruited, and this is the part of the Houston mass murders that people find hardest to hold, and the reason this case is still argued about 50 years later. The boys Elmer Wayne Henley delivered to Dean Corll were his own friends. Frank Aguirre was 17 and weeks away from graduating high school. Johnny DeLome was 16 and had gone to junior high with him. Charles Cobble and Marty Jones lived in an apartment a few streets from Henley's house. Homer Garcia was 15 and had taken driver's education classes alongside him. He knew them. He had grown up with them. He brought them to a house and was paid $200 each. The victims came almost entirely from one neighborhood, the Houston Heights, a poor, tightly packed area where families knew each other and boys roamed freely in the way boys did in 1971. They were lured with the same offer every time: a party, a lift, somewhere to drink. At the house, they were restrained, held sometimes for days, abused, and killed, either by strangulation or with a small caliber pistol. Investigators recovered a purpose-built restraint device from the property. Its function is documented in the trial record. It is not going to be described here, and the reason is the same reason given earlier in this series about the Gray Spud letter. Describing it in detail serves nothing except the appetite it was designed to feed. The bodies were buried in the rented boat stall along a stretch of beach at High Island and in woodland near Lake Sam Rayburn. Between 1970 and 1973, boys disappeared from the Heights at a rate that should have been impossible to ignore. Two brothers, Donald and Jerry Waldrop, aged 15 and 13, vanished on the same day. Friends disappeared in pairs. Boys who lived within a few streets of each other went missing within weeks. Their parents went to the Houston Police Department over and over, and they were told their sons were runaways. Texas in the early 1970s had a genuine and enormous runaway problem. Hundreds of thousands of teenagers left home across America in that period, and police departments were overwhelmed by it. Houston's policy was effectively not to investigate juvenile disappearances at all where a runaway was plausible. So the files were opened and closed. There was no cross-referencing. Nobody sat down and noticed that a dozen boys from the same few streets had gone in 18 months. Two of the mothers, Selma Winkle and Mrs. Hilligiest, went to the newspapers about it afterward. One of them described dealing with the police as talking to a blank wall. They had hired a private investigator with their own money. They had done their own searching. They had been right the entire time, and no one with a badge had listened to them for 3 years. The end came because Elmer Wayne Henley broke a rule. On the night of August 7th, 1973, Henley brought two friends to Corll's house, Timothy Curley, 19, and Rhonda Williams, 15, a girl who had come to Henley in distress after trouble at home. Corll was enraged that Henley had brought a girl. The three teenagers spent the night drinking and inhaling solvent fumes until they passed out. Henley woke up handcuffed. Corll told him he was going to kill all three of them. Then Corll made him an offer: help me with the other two, and you live. Henley talked. He kept talking, and Corll released him. And when Corll's attention was on Curley, Henley picked up the pistol. He shot Dean Corll 6 times. Witnesses recalled him shouting that he could not do it anymore, that he could not let Corll kill his friends. Then he telephoned the police, and then he telephoned his mother and told her he had killed Dean. David Brooks turned himself in the following day, accompanied by his father. Both boys led investigators to the burial sites. The excavation ran for days and was covered live on national television. Henley at one point borrowed a reporter's radio phone at the dig site to call home. Elmer Wayne Henley was convicted in 1974 of 6 murders and sentenced to 6 99-year terms. That conviction was overturned on appeal in 1978 on the grounds that the trial should have been moved away from the publicity. He was retried in 1979, convicted again, and sentenced again. He was never charged over Corll's death. Prosecutors accepted it as self-defense. David Brooks was convicted of murder in 1975 and sentenced to life. Brooks died on May 28, 2020, of complications from COVID-19 in a hospital in Galveston. He was 65 and had served 45 years. Elmer Wayne Henley is 70 years old and held at the Telford Unit in Bowie County, Texas. He has been denied parole at every review since 1980. At his most recent hearing, in November of 2025, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles ruled that he will not be considered again until 2035, when he will be in his late 70s. The families have opposed every application. The parents of Stanton Dremala, 13 years old, Corll's last victim, taken 5 days before it all ended, are believed to be the last surviving parents of any of the boys. His mother has described the sleeplessness that comes around every time a hearing approaches. Henley gave an extended interview for a documentary in 2025, his first substantial public account in 50 years. The forensic psychologist who spoke with him described a man who suffers nightmares, who has been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress, and who does not want to be known as what he is. The family's response to that was, broadly, that he is alive to have nightmares. One of the 28 has never been identified. He was between 15 and 18 years old, recovered from the boat shed, and is cataloged only by a case reference and a nickname investigators gave him from the swimming trunks he was found in. A new facial reconstruction was released in 2023, 50 years on, in the hope that someone might recognize him. Somebody, somewhere, spent the rest of their life not knowing what happened to their son. Investigators involved in the case have long believed the true figure is higher, that there are boys still in the ground in southeast Texas who were never counted because they were never properly reported. because their parents were told the same thing everyone else was told, and that is the fact this case turns on. Dean Corll did not evade a manhunt. There was no manhunt. He operated for 3 years in one neighborhood, taking boys who knew each other from families who reported it immediately and kept reporting it. He was stopped, eventually, by a 17-year-old with a gun who had spent 2 years helping him. Nobody else was coming. Number 8. Arthur Shawcross. In April of 1987, the state of New York released a man who had killed 2 children. He had served 14 years. He was sent first to Binghamton. People there found out who he was, and the pressure was such that he had to be moved. He was relocated to a small village in Delaware County. The same thing happened. He was moved again. So on the third attempt, the authorities handling his case made a decision. They placed him in Rochester, a city of 230,000 people, and they did not tell the Rochester Police Department, and they did not tell the public, and his file was kept closed. The reasoning, on its own terms, was not irrational. A man who cannot be housed anywhere cannot be supervised anywhere. Over the following 2 years, 11 women were murdered in that city. His name was Arthur John Shawcross, and this is the clearest case in this entire series of a killing spree that a functioning system would simply have prevented. He was born on June 6, 1945, in Kittery, Maine, and raised in Watertown in the far north of New York State. He was a poor student who was held back, tested with a below-average IQ, and wet the bed into adolescence. He was large, clumsy, and mocked. Later in life, he would describe a childhood of severe abuse and incest, and it is worth flagging early that almost none of his claims about himself have ever been corroborated. Several were actively disproved. He served in the Army from 1967 to 1969, including a tour in Vietnam. He later described, at length and to multiple psychiatrists, having committed atrocities there, killing Vietnamese women, mutilating them, engaging in cannibalism in the jungle. His military record shows he worked in supply and armaments and saw essentially no combat. That detail matters more than it might appear, because when he eventually stood trial, his entire defense rested on the proposition that he was telling the truth about himself. He returned to Watertown and began setting fires. He was convicted of arson and burglary and served time. He was released on parole. And in 1972, while on that parole, he killed 2 children. Jack Blake was 10 years old and disappeared in May. Karen Ann Hill was 8 and was killed in September. Both cases are in the public record, and neither is going to be detailed here. Shawcross was arrested that October and confessed to both. But Jack Blake's body had not been found, and prosecutors had an evidentiary problem. So they made a deal. Shawcross would plead guilty to a single count of manslaughter in Karen Hill's death, and in exchange he would tell them where Jack Blake was. He was sentenced to 25 years. He served 14 and a half and was paroled in 1987 at the age of 41. In Rochester, he took work as a food preparation worker, packing salads at a produce company. He married. He also maintained a relationship with another woman, Clara Neal, whose car he borrowed regularly. To everyone who dealt with him, he was an unremarkable, overweight, middle-aged man who fished a lot. In March of 1988, the body of a 27-year-old woman named Dorothy Blackburn was recovered from a creek outside the city. Over the next 21 months, 10 more women were killed. Anna Stephan, Dorothy Keeler, Patricia Ives, June Stott, Frances Brown, Maria Welch, Elizabeth Gibson, Darlene Trippi, June Cicero, Felicia Steffens. Most of them were working the streets around Lyell Avenue, an area of Rochester where women sold sex, and where the police response to a disappearance was, predictably, slow. You have now heard this sentence in some form about Gary Ridgway, about Andre Chikatilo, about Dean Corll, and about Pedro Elpez. It is the single most repeated fact in this entire series. He selected the people whose absence would generate the least urgency, and he was right every time. One victim did not fit the pattern. June Stott was 30, was not a sex worker, and knew him. The violence in her case was markedly worse than the others, and investigators initially wondered whether they were dealing with a second offender. The bodies were found in and around the Genesee River basin and the creeks and gorges feeding at wooded, remote places on the edge of the city. And investigators working the case developed a theory about the man they were looking for. They believed he was going back. By late 1989, a task force including FBI profilers had concluded that the killer was returning to the sites where he had left bodies, which meant the way to catch him was not to look for him. It was to find a body he did not know had been found, and wait. On the 31st of December, 1989, a discarded pair of jeans containing an identification card belonging to Felicia Stevens turned up near the river. New York State Police launched an aerial search of the area. On January 2nd, 1990, a state police helicopter crew flying over Salmon Creek saw something on the ice below a bridge. It was a body not Felicia Stevens, but June Cicero, who had been missing for 2 weeks, and standing on the bridge directly above her, next to a small van, was a middle-aged man. The crew radioed it in. The van drove off. Ground units traced the registration, which came back to Clara Neal. Arthur Shawcross was picked up for questioning within 48 hours, and he handed police the last piece himself. Asked to produce his driver's license, he told them he had never got it back after his manslaughter conviction. Nobody in that room had known there was a manslaughter conviction. His records were sealed. That sentence is what opened them. He denied everything for a period. He broke when investigators established that a piece of jewelry he had given Clara Neal had belonged to June Cicero and indicated they could charge her as an accessory. He then gave a formal confession that ran to roughly 80 pages, and he led investigators to two bodies that had never been found, Maria Welch and Darlene Trippi. He gave an explanation for each killing, and in every one of them, he was the one who had been wronged. His trial opened in November of 1990 and ran 13 weeks. He never took the stand. The question, as with Dahmer and Chikatilo and Gacy before him, was sanity. The defense retained Dr. Dorothy Ottnow Lewis, a psychiatrist with a serious academic reputation and a long-standing thesis that violent offenders are overwhelmingly products of brain injury and childhood trauma. Lewis examined Shawcross extensively, including under hypnosis, and those sessions were videotaped and shown to the jury. On the tapes, Shawcross shifts into a high-pitched woman's voice. He says his mother's voice instructs him. He describes the atrocities in Vietnam. He describes the incest. And at one point, he explains to Dr. Lewis that in a previous life, he had been a cannibal in medieval England. The prosecution retained Dr. Park Dietz, the same forensic psychiatrist who would appear at Jeffrey Dahmer's trial 2 years later. Dietz interviewed Shawcross, too, also on video. And in those sessions, Shawcross said something rather different. He said he did not hear voices. He said he did not have other personalities. He answered as an ordinary man. Dietz's conclusion was that Shawcross was malingering that he had worked out what a psychiatrist wanted to hear and was producing it, adjusting the performance depending on who was in the room. The jury watched both sets of tapes. They deliberated for 6.5 hours and convicted him on 10 counts of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 250 years. He later pleaded guilty to the murder of Elizabeth Gibson, killed in a neighboring county, and received a further sentence. An 11th Rochester death, that of Kimberly Logan, was never charged. Shawcross denied it. Some investigators believed then, and believe now, that he was responsible. Arthur Shawcross died on November 10th, 2008, at a hospital in Albany of cardiac arrest. He was 63 and had served 18 years. In 2002, 6 years before that, there had been a public controversy in New York over the discovery that he was selling artwork he produced in prison. The corrections department shut the program down. So, what is this case actually about? It is not about Vietnam, because he was a supply clerk. It is not about a medieval past life. It is not about multiple personalities, because he told a different psychiatrist he had none. Every explanation Arthur Shawcross offered for himself was a story shaped for whoever was listening, and a jury in Rochester saw through all of them in an afternoon. It is about a parole decision. A man convicted of killing 2 children served 14 and a half years and walked out. 2 communities were told who he was and drove him out. The third was not told, because by then the problem had become where to put him rather than whether he should be out at all. 11 women in Rochester paid for that. Their names were Dorothy Blackburn, Anna Steffen, Dorothy Keeler, Patricia Ives, June Stott, Frances Brown, Maria Welch, Elizabeth Gibson, Darlene Trippi, June Cicero, and Felicia Stevens, possibly Kimberly Logan as well. Most of them were poor. Most of them were selling sex to survive. Almost none of them made the front page while they were still missing. And he was found, in the end, not by the profile and not by the task force, but because a helicopter happened to fly over a bridge on a January morning while he was standing on it, admiring his own work. Number 9. Ahmad Suradji. In the spring of 1997, police in North Sumatra began digging up a sugarcane field on the outskirts of Medan. They recovered 42 bodies, all of them women and girls, all of them buried in the same plantation over a period of 11 years within walking distance of a single house, and every one of them had been positioned the same way, with the head oriented toward that house, because the man who put them there believed the arrangement was doing something for him. Here is the part that separates this case from every other one in this series. He did not abduct any of them. He did not follow anyone home, or wait at a bus station, or climb through a window, or offer anyone a lift. 42 women walked to his door and asked for his help. His name was Ahmad Suradji. Indonesian newspapers called him Dukun AS. To understand this case, you have to understand what a Dukun is and to be accurate about it. A Dukun is a traditional practitioner found across Indonesia, a healer, spiritual advisor, and intermediary. The role is old, widespread, and for most people entirely ordinary. Dukun set bones, deliver babies, prepare herbal remedies, advise on marriages, and read situations. In rural Indonesia in the 1980s and 90s, a dukun was often the most accessible source of help in a village, particularly where doctors were distant and expensive. The overwhelming majority of them are exactly what they present themselves as. This is not a story about Indonesian spiritual practice being sinister. It is a story about a man who took a position of trust that already existed in his community and used it as an instrument, in precisely the way Harold Shipman used a medical license and John Wayne Gacy used a civic reputation. Ahmad Suradji was born on January 10th, 1949, in North Sumatra. He worked as a cattle breeder. He had a criminal record for theft and property offenses from earlier in his life. He was not satisfied with cattle. He set himself up as a dukun and built a practice working out of his home in a village outside Medan. He took 3 wives, Tumini, Tumina, and Ingatia, who were sisters, and around 1986 he began telling people about a dream. In it, he said, his dead father had come to him with an instruction. To become a true and powerful mystic healer, Suradji would have to drink the saliva of 70 women after their deaths. He reasoned, by his own account to police, that waiting for 70 women to die naturally would take longer than he had. His clientele were overwhelmingly women, and they came to him about the things people bring to a dukun: money, love, health, appearance, wives who wanted a husband to stop straying, young women who wanted to be beautiful, poor women who wanted to stop being poor. Some were sex workers hoping to attract more clients or to leave the work entirely. Indonesia in the late 1980s and 90s was modernizing fast and unevenly. Rural North Sumatra was poor. For a woman with no money, no education, and a problem she could not solve, a Dukun was not a superstition. He was the option available. Suradji would hear the request, agree to help, and name a fee. And then he would tell her that the ritual had to be performed at night in the sugarcane and that she should tell no one where she was going because speaking of it would break the spell. At the field, he had her stand in a hole and buried her to the waist, explaining that this was part of the working. Then, with her fixed in place and unable to move, he killed her with a length of cable. He took her clothing and jewelry. He buried her fully, oriented toward his house. And then he went home. Now hold the mechanism up and look at it, because this is the most efficient victim selection system in this entire series. The women came voluntarily. They came alone. They came in secret because he had told them to, and because most of them would have kept it secret anyway. Consulting a Dukun about your husband's faithfulness, or about your appearance, or about money is a private and slightly embarrassing thing. You do not announce it. So when a woman did not come home, her family often did not know where she had gone. They knew she had gone somewhere. They did not know to say his name. Add to that a rural policing system with limited resources, a population that included many internal migrants and transient workers, and a community that held Dukun in genuine regard and was reluctant to accuse one. Investigators working the case afterward described exactly this, that local people were hesitant to come forward against a man in his position, and that the victim's own discretion had erased the trail before anyone started looking. For 11 years, Ahmad Suradji did not have to hide anything. The secrecy was built into the transaction. It ended in April of 1997. A 21-year-old woman named Sri Kamala Dewi hired a rickshaw and asked the driver to take her out to a village outside Medan. She did not come back. Her family reported her missing, and this time there was a witness the young rickshaw driver knew where he had taken her. Her body was found in the sugarcane field near Suradji's house. He was arrested on the 30th of April, 1997, and under questioning he admitted Dewi's murder. Then he kept going and told investigators there were others in the same field. The excavation ran for weeks. 42 sets of remains were recovered. Many had been in the ground so long they could not be identified at all, and some of those women have never been named. His 3 wives were arrested for assisting him and helping to conceal the bodies. Tumini, the eldest sister, was prosecuted as his accomplice. The trial opened at the Lubuk Pakam District Court in December of 1997 on an indictment running to 363 pages. Suradji did not dispute the killings. His position was that he had been compelled, that the dream and the instruction in it were real and binding. Among the witnesses was an 8-year-old boy who had gone with his mother to Suradji's house before she disappeared. He was the last person who had seen her, and he had to describe that visit in a courtroom. On the 27th of April, 1998, Suradji was convicted of 42 counts of murder and sentenced to death. People in the courtroom cheered. Tumini received the same sentence, later commuted to life imprisonment. She has been held at a penitentiary in Medan ever since. Suradji spent 10 years on death row through appeals and 2 clemency petitions, both rejected by the president. He was executed by firing squad in Deli Serdang, North Sumatra, on the night of the 10th of July, 2008. He was 59. An official present said he appeared resigned. His final request was to see his wife, and it was granted. And then something happened that has no parallel anywhere else in this series. Nobody would let him be buried. The authorities intended to return his body to his own village. Hundreds of residents blockaded the road and turned the ambulance back. He had killed their neighbors, and they were not going to have him in their ground. The convoy diverted to a public cemetery near the district offices. Relatives of the victims were already there, reportedly around 100 of them, waiting to stop it. His body sat in a hospital morgue while officials worked out what to do with it. He was eventually buried in a cemetery several kilometers away, in a village where nobody had lost anyone. Amnesty International had appealed against the execution, as it does in every capital case. Indonesia had resumed executions the previous month after a 14-month pause. Ahmad Suradji killed more people than Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Dennis Rader, Ed Gein, Aileen Wuornos, Richard Ramirez, and David Berkowitz combined. Almost nobody outside Southeast Asia has heard of him. Part of that is language and distance. Part of it is that his victims were poor rural Indonesian women, and the international press has never been especially interested in those. But part of it is that this case does not offer what the genre usually wants. There is no manhunt, no task force, no profiler, no chase. There is a man in a village who told frightened, hopeful women to come at night and tell nobody, and then buried them in a field 40 paces from his own door for 11 years. He was caught because one of them took a rickshaw, and the driver remembered the way. That is the entire investigation. 42 women. The youngest was 11 years old. Many of them are still cataloged only by a number, because there was not enough left to give them back their names. Every single one of them went to that house because she believed the man inside it was going to help her. Number 10. Belle Gunness. Ahmad Suradji's victims came to him. So did hers, but they came further, and they brought money. Between about 1905 and 1908, advertisements ran in Norwegian-language newspapers across the American Midwest. They were placed by a widow in Indiana who owned a large farm and was looking for a husband. The wording was direct. She was comfortable. She had property. She was seeking a man of some means to join her. Triflers, she noted, need not apply. And there was one condition. Any serious applicant should bring cash with him, enough to clear the mortgage on the farm as proof that he was in earnest. Men wrote to her from Minnesota, Wisconsin, South Dakota, Illinois. She wrote back warm, personal, encouraging letters, sometimes several a week. Then they packed a case, withdrew their savings, told their friends they were going to Indiana to be married, and got on a train. And that was the last anyone heard of them. Her name was Belle Gunness. The newspapers called her Hell's Belle, and the Lady Bluebeard, and the Mistress of Murder Hill. She is one of the most prolific female killers in recorded history, and she may or may not have died in 1908, and after 118 years, nobody has been able to settle it. She was born Brynhild Paulsdatter Sturseth on November 11th, 1859, in Selbu, Norway, the youngest of 8 children in a poor farming family. From the age of 14, she worked on neighboring farms, milking and herding cattle, saving for a ticket. In 1881, she sailed for America and joined an older sister in Chicago, and somewhere in the crossing Brynhild became Belle. She was physically formidable, around 5 feet 8, and heavy, and by every account extremely strong. She worked at one point in a butcher's shop. In 1884, she married a fellow Norwegian immigrant named Mads Sorensen. They ran a confectionery shop in Chicago. And then things around Belle Sorensen began to burn down and die. The shop burned. The insurance paid. A house they owned burned. The insurance paid. 2 infant children died of what was recorded as acute intestinal illness, and both had been insured. On July 30th, 1900, Mads Sorensen died at home. The recorded cause was heart failure. The first physician to see him suspected strychnine poisoning. He died on the single day when two overlapping life insurance policies were both in force. Belle collected on both. His family pushed for an exhumation. Nothing came of it. With the money, she bought a 42-acre farm outside LaPorte, Indiana, and moved there with her daughters and a foster child named Jenny Olsen. In 1902, she married a Norwegian widower called Peter Gunness. His infant daughter died within a week of the wedding, while alone in the house with Belle. Peter Gunness himself died that December. Belle's account was that a heavy sausage grinder had fallen from a high shelf onto his head. The coroner's jury was openly skeptical. An inquest was held. Belle was visibly pregnant and the case went no further. She collected the insurance. She was now a widow with a farm, a reputation for bad luck, and a working method. Around 1905, the advertisements started, and here's what makes Belle Gunness structurally different from almost everyone else in this series. She never went anywhere. Bundy drove for hours. Ridgway worked a highway corridor. Chikatilo rode trains for years. Corll's accomplices walked the neighborhood looking for boys. Belle Gunness sat on a farm in Indiana and had her victims delivered to her by the American railway system at their own expense, carrying their own money. Her victim selection was also the most precisely targeted in this entire video, and it was targeted by language. She advertised in Norwegian language papers because she wanted Norwegian immigrant bachelor's men who had come to America alone, worked hard, accumulated savings, and had no relatives in the country. Men who could sell a farm or empty a bank account without consulting anybody. Men whose absence would not be noticed for months and whose families, if they had any, were 4,000 miles away and did not speak English. John Moe came from Minnesota with over $1,000. Ole Budsberg came from Wisconsin and mortgaged his land first. Henry Gerholt came. Olaf Lindboe came. Others came whose names are no longer known. The pattern was always the same. A man arrived in LaPorte, was seen in town with Mrs. Gunness for a day or two, and was never seen again. If anyone asked, he had gone back home, or moved on to Chicago, or turned out to be unsuitable. Her foster daughter, Jenny Olsen, also disappeared in 1906 at 16. Belle explained that she had been sent to a finishing school in California. Then, in January of 1908, a South Dakota farmer named Andrew Helgelian withdrew nearly $3,000 and traveled to LaPorte to marry her. And Andrew Helgelian had a brother. Asla Helgelian wrote to Belle asking where Andrew was. She wrote back with explanations. He wrote again and again. Her answers stopped making sense, and he kept writing anyway. On April 28, 1908, the Gunness farmhouse burned to the ground. In the cellar, searchers found 4 bodies. 3 were Belle's children Myrtle, Lucy, and Philip. The 4th was an adult woman. She had no head, and the head was never found. Belle Gunness had made out her will and purchased 5 gallons of kerosene the day before the fire. Her former handyman, Ray Lamphere, a man she had employed, fallen out with, sacked, and then tried to have committed to an asylum, was arrested for arson and murder. And then Asla Helgelian arrived from South Dakota and refused to leave until somebody dug. The excavation of the Gunness farm uncovered human remains across the property, concentrated in the soft ground of the hog pen and the rubbish area. At least 11 bodies were recovered, dismembered and buried in sacks with quicklime. Among them were Andrew Helgelian and Jenny Olsen. Several of the dead contained lethal levels of strychnine. Some could not be identified at all. Estimates of the total have ranged from 14 upward. Some historians put it at 25 to 30, some go to 40. The honest answer is that nobody knows how many men got off a train at LaPorte between 1902 and 1908, because a substantial number of them had told nobody they were going. Asle Helgelian is the only reason any of it was found. The forensic anthropologist who later studied the case said as much without him, those bodies stay in the ground. That is now the sixth or seventh time in this series that a case was broken by one relative who would not accept the explanation they were given. Ray Lamphere was tried in November of 1908. The jury convicted him of arson and acquitted him of murder, which is to say, they concluded he burned the house down and that whoever the woman in the cellar was, he had not killed her. He died of tuberculosis in prison the following year. Before he died, he is said to have told a fellow prisoner and a clergyman that Belle had escaped, that she had lured a housekeeper from Chicago specifically to leave a body behind, and that he had driven her away himself. That claim is unverified, secondhand, and came from a man with every reason to say it. The question of whether Belle Gunness died in that fire has never been closed. The case for escape, the body was headless. She bought kerosene and wrote a will the day before. She had every reason to run, with Ashley Helgilian's letters arriving. Neighbors who viewed the remains said it was not her. Her dental bridge work was found in the ashes, but it was found late, by a man hired specifically to sift for it, and a woman planning her own disappearance would know exactly what to leave behind. The case against, someone still had to kill 3 children and behead a woman and burn a house, and Ray Lamphere was acquitted of doing it. There have been sightings for a century. In 1931, a woman in Los Angeles named Esther Carlson was arrested for poisoning a man for money and died before trial. Some believed she was Belle. The photographs are inconclusive. In 2007, a forensic anthropology team from the University of Indianapolis exhumed the headless body from its grave in a Chicago cemetery with the permission of a descendant of Belle's sister. They intended to compare its DNA against saliva on the sealed flap of an envelope Belle had licked preserved because the man who received her letter had opened it with a letter opener. The saliva was too old. The bones were too degraded. Samples went to multiple laboratories. No conclusive profile could be obtained, but they did establish one thing, and it cuts against the legend rather than for it. The central claim of the escape theory has always been that the body in the cellar was too small to be Belle Gunness. When the team measured the skeleton, it indicated a woman who had stood somewhere between 5 feet 6 and 5 feet 9. Belle Gunness was 5 feet 8. The only scientific measurement ever taken of that body puts her squarely inside the range. That does not prove it was her. It proves that the thing everyone has repeated for 100 years as the foundation of the whole mystery does not hold up. So the case remains open, and it will probably stay open. What is not in doubt is the rest of it. 2 husbands, several children, including her own, a foster daughter, and a succession of hard-working immigrant men who read a warm letter from a widow in Indiana, withdrew everything they had, and got on a train. They were not careless. They were not foolish. They were lonely men in a country that had given them very little, who had been offered a farm and a wife and a place to stop. She understood exactly what that was worth to them, and she priced it at whatever they had in the bank.